It's an honor to be here today. Thank you so much for your interest in joining this panel and attending this panel. I want to start out by, I'm going to talk about the human rights recommendations issued to the United States over the course of the past year with respect to immigrants and the right to health. But first, a little bit of background. So under international human rights law, the right to health is a foundational right. It was established under the the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which the United States played a strong role in drafting. And the United States has also recognized the right to health through a series of other instruments. We have signed one of the core covenants that form the International Bill of Rights. So Jamil mentioned the first one, which is the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. There's also another one, it's complementary, covenant on economic and social rights. And so the US is a signatory to this convention, and by signing it, we have acknowledged that the right to health, among other social and economic rights, is an important foundational human right. With our ratification of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, however, we assumed a binding obligation to ensure that everyone in the United States is able to exercise the right to health without discrimination. So this means that under international law, discrimination, the right to non-discrimination is much broader than it is in the United States in our constitutional framework. So discrimination includes both discrimination in law and discrimination in effect. So we have assumed this obligation to make our laws and policies and practices free from discrimination with respect to all of the substantive rights under that treaty, including the right to health. International law also recognizes broader categories of protected classes. So as Jamil mentioned, the right to non-discrimination is also extended to people free to experience our laws and to participate as full and equal members of society, free from discrimination on the basis of immigration status. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. And finally, throughout all of these review processes and with the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review, there's a strong emphasis on addressing intersectional forms of discrimination. So the committees and these review bodies look at how people are situated differently and therefore how they might experience discrimination differently. So, for example, when analyzing US progress on eliminating gender discrimination, the committees also look at women of color and how their experience of discrimination is different. Or conversely, if they're looking at gender discrimination, they're going to look at how immigrant women are able to access the same rights and benefits. So my organization with Latina Institute teamed up in 2013 to raise the issue of immigrants' lack of access to health care and lack of access to reproductive health care specifically as a human rights violation throughout all of these treaty reviews, because we recognize that immigrant women are sitting at the intersection of all of these multiple forms of discrimination, unable to access health care, and this is the inability to exercise this basic human right is having a devastating impact on their families, their communities, and really the nation as a whole, because it really does affect all of us. So let me back up a little bit, and I'm going to talk about how we got to that decision of deciding to elevate this issue to these international bodies. In 2013, we documented the rights violations that were caused by the state of Texas and its devastating assault on women's health care. Texas decided in 2011, to cut its family planning services, its state-funded family planning services, by 2/3. Now, this was a time when many states it was during the recession, many states were cutting back on social services, but this was particularly devastating because, first of all, it was an orchestrated assault on women's health more broadly, aimed at Planned Parenthood. But Planned Parenthood was by far the state's largest provider of family planning services. And when it cut this funding and also made some other policy changes that made it impossible for Planned Parenthood and other independent clinics to receive any of the remaining funding, that had an immediate impact on the frontline services that many immigrant women receive in Texas. So it closed overnight, virtually overnight. 76 clinics around the state closed. Countless others were forced to cut back services and lay off workers. And of course, the first services and the locations to go were the ones that were in these frontline communities. So our documentation focused on the lower Rio Grande Valley on the border of Mexico. And the clinics that had been serving these women for decades and providing really their only source of health care disappeared. So women had nowhere to go. And they were suffering a range of human rights violations as a result of this, from unintended pregnancy to suddenly facing a diagnosis of cervical cancer, breast cancer, serious reproductive health illnesses, and a range of other impacts. This is an area that is medically underserved. It's federally designated as such, and had always faced problems. The population there had always faced problems in accessing health care. It has a high uninsured rate, a lack of healthcare providers, severe poverty, transportation barriers, all of which combined make it especially important for these clinics to exist and provide the healthcare that they do. And so their disappearance was really devastating for women. Just as an example, for cervical cancer, this is a disease that is 100% preventable. And as many of you know who work on immigrant rights and health, the rate of cervical cancer in immigrant communities is soaring, even though it is decreasing nationally overall. And this is because immigrant women don't have access to basic testing, which can detect and prevent this disease. So just again, our report showed how violations like this can lead to not only violations of the right to be free from discrimination and accessing health care, but really core fundamental human rights like violations of the right to life, the violations of the right to be free from ill treatment, because the denial of health care can lead to ill treatment in many cases. So we produced a documentation report, and we also pulled together human rights analysis for each of these treaty bodies that Jamil mentioned earlier, showing how that what was happening in the Rio Grande Valley violated civil and political rights, as well as economic and social rights, and the freedom from ill treatment, as discussed by the Committee Against Torture. So let's go first to the Human Rights Committee slide. This was our first opportunity to engage at the human rights level, which we found, just push the arrow. Actually, there we go. Maybe pull back a little bit, so we can see the text. There we go. So this occurred in March 2014, this review, and the photo that you're looking at is a photo of a community leader from the Rio Grande Valley named Lucy Felix, who testified before the Human Rights Committee in Geneva about the particular impact on women in her community, raising up their stories and talking about these issues in human rights terms. As a result, the committee expressed a lot of concern to the United States about the difficulties that immigrants face in accessing adequate and affordable health care. They raised concern about the total exclusion of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants from the ACA, as well as restrictions on access to Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program that many lawfully present immigrants face. And just for context, many of these experts who were looking at the United States record in this area were shocked to learn that people who are here legally in the United States are not able to access public health insurance. So the Center for Reproductive Rights actually engaged a large pro bono law firm to look at, to do a comparative study for us throughout the world, looking at similarly situated countries, advanced economies, to look at whether they extended benefits, healthcare benefits to documents who were in their countries legally, and all of them did without waiting periods, with one exception, and in that case, if you could show that you were working and contributing taxes, the waiting period was waived. So as you can tell, not only does this policy violate international human rights law, but it's also quite out of step with the world community. So I want to just call attention to the particular recommendation, which is that the committee recommends that the state party, the United States, identify ways to facilitate access to adequate health care, including reproductive health services, by undocumented immigrants and immigrants and their families who have been residing lawfully in the United States for less than 5 years. So the committee really understood the importance of highlighting barriers to both undocumented immigrants and those who are here legally in the United States. The next slide looks at the recommendation by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and this was in August of 2014, so following very soon after the recommendation by the Human Rights Committee. This committee, as I mentioned earlier, there is a specific obligation to eliminate non-discrimination in the right to health care, and this committee focuses very much on the intersection of racial and gender discrimination. So the last review, for example, by this committee in 2008, they made a special point of looking at health disparities in sexual and reproductive health, so in particular maternal mortality, unintended pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV/AIDS, and saying the racial disparities here in the United States constitute discrimination in and of themselves, and the U.S. needs to do more to address these. This year, it built off the recommendation from the Human Rights Committee and raised alarms about the particular barriers that immigrants face, many of whom are members of racial and ethnic minority communities. And their specific recommendation was to take concrete measures to ensure that all individuals, in particular undocumented immigrants and immigrants and their families who have been residing lawfully in the U.S. for less than 5 years, have effective access to affordable and adequate healthcare services. So you can see that the language gets a little bit stronger. It's about concrete measures and effective access. And then finally, by the time we got to the Universal Periodic Review, we had built momentum by these prior two committees issuing these recommendations. And improving access to healthcare for immigrants was a common theme that was raised. So during this debate that happened at the Human Rights Council, 5 countries actually questioned the U.S. about their policies denying healthcare to undocumented and lawfully present immigrants. And several called on the U.S. to ensure access to healthcare for all who are in their territory. 3 countries, in addition to Peru, which is the one cited here, Portugal and Honduras, included recommendations specifically calling on the U.S. to design legislation and take other steps to address these gaps. Honduras also specifically called on the U.S. to pay attention to eligibility requirements for women and children, excuse me. So just in summary, the recommendations that we received from all of these bodies say a few things. First, to address the gaps in access for undocumented immigrants under the Affordable Care Act. Second, to lift the 5-year bar on lawfully present immigrants for Medicaid and CHIP. Third, to prioritize access for women and children. And finally, to prioritize reproductive health care as part of our overall obligation to ensure access to health care. So finally, what can Congress do? So implementation of these recommendations can happen in several different ways, but I'm going to cite specific legislation that exists now that would address many of these concerns raised by these different countries and these treaty bodies. So the Health, Equity, and Access Under the Law for Immigrant Women and Families Act, the HEAL Act for short, is legislation that was introduced last Congress by Representative Lujan Grisham and then reintroduced in April 2015. It currently has 39 co-sponsors. This bill is a proactive vision that would eliminate many of the barriers to health care for immigrants. It would restore access to health insurance benefits that were repealed in 1996 under welfare reform, and provide a fix for what is an unnecessarily complex and convoluted system and set of rules to determine eligibility. This bill simply says that if you are in the country with legal status, you have access to the healthcare programs that your tax dollars support. in the absence of comprehensive immigration reform, this is also a really wonderful way to support a proactive vision, to support integration of immigrants into the larger fabric of American society. So I'm going to stop there, but look forward to questions later. Thank you very much.